Hi there guys, welcome to this video. So today I wanted to talk about genetics, and this video is gonna be what I call from now on trending video. I'm gonna make a series about trending videos where I'll probably try to make videos almost every day. I wanted to be uploading more often. These are reacting basically to trends which I believe are going against my truth and I think the truth for a lot of natural bodybuilders. So for example, today is about genetics. I wanted to make a little point about this. When you see big influencers who sometimes, in my opinion, don't say things that are right, I want to obviously, as a natural bodybuilder and helping the natural bodybuilding community, tell my opinion so that it can help beginners, for example, not be discouraged by what other people say on bigger channels who have a lot of influence. So here in particular, it's genetics. I wanted to make a video about this topic because often I see big channels who talk about genetics. One thing which is weird is about Greg Doucette.
How freaking dare you!
Or more plates, more dates.
Our content.
They either say that you can naturally achieve something great, and on the other hand, they also say the opposite. They kind of contradict themselves quite often on this one. So they'll say, oh, I can't believe this guy could have reached this naturally, and the natural potential is actually more than you'd think if you actually give it quite a lot of work. And on the other hand, when there is someone actually looking like good, like it's achievable naturally, they'll say, oh, I think this guy is probably taking something, like you can't look like this. So I'm always really confused. What comes back more often than not is basically relying too much on genetics to explain something. So in the fitness community, what I tend to see when I look at fitness influencers is that they more often than not say that genetics play a big role, which I agree to an extent, but at the same time not. I think you can actually reach an incredible physique naturally, even if your genetics are supposedly bad. Because to me there is no bad genetics. Perhaps there are good genetics, but I don't think there are bad genetics. So you have normal genetics, I guess, and you can have good genetics for some people. So if you look at Lee Priest, for example, well, this guy obviously has good genetics in terms of how fast he's developed and how perhaps he's been reacting to anabolics, his frame, the way he looks, the proportions. Of course there is genetics which matter to a certain extent as well, how your muscle are looking, if they're short, they're long, if your abs are symmetrical. These are genetics that obviously matter. But in terms of, I would say, muscle size that you can reach as a natural, I think everyone can look very big. So like obviously someone who is very small might not reach 18 inches arms, but proportionally to his body he can reach 16 inches arms, which are huge. And someone a bit taller, I believe as a natural, can reach 18 and a half inches, maybe 19, and even more. I think that overall everyone can reach an incredible body mass, natural body mass, which is exceptional at whether you're small, whether you're tall. So I think that's the biggest thing to remember, at least in this video, is that perhaps there are good genetics, but there aren't bad genetics. I guess there is, a certain, when you call bad genetics, it's just someone, for example, who might start being overweight, or someone who might start very skinny. But that's just their starting point, but it doesn't mean that after they don't have the potential, like everyone else, to reach an incredible level. So the difference between good genetics and normal genetics, because I don't want to call bad genetics, it's just that you might have to do more work to get to the level of someone with good genetics. But I also want to point out that most of the people who have good genetics to start with, and when I say good genetics, it's usually that sometimes people who have good genetics or are easily putting on muscle or have good proportions, they also kind of don't have this hard work to put on to actually reach a great level. So sometimes they're actually lazier than people who have to put the work on, that people who have quote-unquote bad genetics, because they actually don't really realize that they have that much work to do. And oftentimes you see people with the not so good genetics actually going past, overtaking people who have good genetics. Of course, if the people with good genetics work their ass off like no one else, then it's very hard to catch them. It's hard to be as good as them, but a lot of people who have good genetics won't work as hard as they could because they've always kind of been gifted and never basically learned the hard way. Also, I want to point out that oftentimes you will look at people thinking they have great genetics, but they're actually perhaps, athletic. So that happens very often when you're young. So like if you're 16, 17 years old, you will see, for example, your friend or at school, whatever, if you're, I don't know, playing, football, soccer, someone who is ripped. That can happen as well. I will talk about this with black people. Sometimes they do have great genetics and a great shape from the get-go. But what happens is that when you're young, your standards are pretty low. So if you've never lifted before and you actually look at someone who has abs, you're like, wow, we'll start talking about genetics, like look at his shape. And then when you start working on yourself and give it a few years of working out, you look back at the guy that you thought was incredible genetics, and you're like, the guy has a pretty nice shape, but like it's not as big or as incredible as I thought it was at the time. It's just because sometimes your standards are pretty low and you're not satisfied with your body, with the shape you have. And when you look at someone who is pretty gifted or has abs from the get-go without having done much, you will think that these are great genetics and so on, but these are just basically a basic level. It's not that incredible, and you realize soon enough that if you start working out a little bit, you will reach that level pretty fast, and years after years you realize that you're actually much better shape than what you thought was the good standard back then. Coming back to the black genetics, is it true that black people have better genetics than white people, for example? If we take, I guess, both populations, yes, there might be more black people with better genetics. I'm not pulling out any scientific statistics, etc. I've just noticed obviously that sometimes black people have great genetics from the get-go, and some of them put incredible amount of muscle without working as hard as some other people do. And if they both work hard, have good genetics, they get sometimes to an incredible level. I used to train in the gym where there was a friend, and he was black and he had an incredible shape, and he was working decently in the gym, but compared to what some people would do, compared to him in terms of hours, in terms of intensity, in terms of investment in the gym, in terms of lift, which were much bigger and used for hypertrophy, not just for strength, and they would still look far from his physique. And I would train basically 7 days a week or many hours every day, and this guy was maybe training 3-4 times a week, sometimes take a week or 2 weeks off, and he was almost the size as I was. So if the guy was training the way I was training, I can't even imagine how big this guy would be. But at the same time, he wasn't able to train this much, and I don't know, training sounded harder seemed harder for him compared to some other people were able to do much more, and they were less big, and this guy obviously was just genetically pretty gifted, and if he had trained even harder and harder, again, I don't know where he would be, but his physique would be very impressive and perhaps bigger than I was, even though I would be putting a lot of time in there. But that shows that even you might not have the best genetics to start with, you can still beat some people who have great genetics. And if you work harder than most of the people around you, even those who have better genetics, you can still beat them because obviously if you're spending much more time than them in the gym, that you're focusing on detail, trying to really make your body in proportion, then there is probably a way to beat them. Same when you go on stage. Some people might look better than you, but if you're more confident, if you pose better on stage than they do, you might win. So at least on this part of the sport, it's not totally unfair sometimes in bodybuilding, even though I do believe that this sport is pretty unfair. I do believe that sometimes there is actually a chance for the ones who aren't the favorite basically to still win through other methods, like posing well, being confident on stage, and showing the judges that you've worked what they've asked you to work on, etc. So all hopes are not lost for those who have not great genetics, or those who basically want to beat people with better muscle development than them, or that better proportions, gifted proportions compared to them.
I remember Flex Wheeler once said, he says, I never saw Dorian as beatable. Like that's Flex Wheeler. Like Flex Wheeler during that time was a human specimen. Like he was the LeBron James of bodybuilding. You looked at his physique and you're like, how does this make any sense? But he himself didn't psychologically think you were beatable.
Well, that's the advantage that I had over him. I had a little bit more mental tenacity. Probably Flex had more natural talent than me, because let's say that I did everything and I achieved 100% like my effort and dedication, and so I got 100% of my potential fulfilled. We'll never know, but let's say for argument that I did, I would say that Flex probably maybe did 70%.
Would his 100 have beaten you?
Very possibly. When we were competing together, I said, like, if this guy did what I do, I have a real hard time beating him. Because I know
if he did what you did.
Yeah, if he did what I did, if he had my brain, my approach, my dedication, because he seemed to develop this phenomenal physique with not, you know, an absolute great deal of effort. It came quite easy to him, I think, and I think sometimes when things come easy, you don't need to really look and search for that, you know, to do that 100%, because it's already there, right?
I agree.
To me, it's always the same people that we hear talk about genetics more often than not. These people are naturals who haven't pushed hard enough, who haven't trained long enough or trained the right way to actually see what was possible, and will blame on genetics. Some of them will even jump on steroids like we see it so often, and they will get a physique that is pretty average on steroids. And the other people who usually talk about genetics are these influencers who, you know, always question natty or not, etc. That's what I've observed. They often talk about genetics. I don't know why. In my opinion, everyone can look like they're on steroids naturally to a certain level, to the level where people doubt that you're natural because you actually look very muscly, but not to the extent where you look like Ronnie Coleman, obviously. And this whether you start with what people call the worst genetic. So this video was mainly to say don't get discouraged if you think you have basically bad genetics or what people would define as bad genetics. I think you have a great potential like everyone else if you manage to lift some heavy loads in your hypertrophy program. So over time that takes years, obviously. But if you're someone who one day can squat 150 for 20 reps, that you can bench press 40 times 100 kg and do basically with this kind of weights, this kind of hypertrophy work with them, don't worry, you will get big. There is no other way around. If you manage to do hypertrophy training with this kind of loads, you will be big, you will be huge, even as a natural. If you looked at it, there was that young guy who has a big YouTube channel, Joe Fraser, and he was basically calling Greg Doucette, and he was making a video about his genetics and how it mattered a lot. And I'm sorry, this guy hasn't trained long enough, and perhaps hasn't maybe trained the right way, or even though it doesn't look to be training this bad, I'm sure it could probably do better. So when I see these videos who have massive influences around the fitness industry, I think that this is a shame, because the guy has only been training as well like a year and a half, maybe seriously, and his physique is pretty good for a year and a half. He just hasn't waited long enough to be able basically to make claims about genetics. I think this guy in 5-6 years, if he carries on training hard, etc., will have a great physique and will obviously say that genetics don't matter anymore. And so that's a shame. This is why I make these training videos, trying to obviously correct the misinformation that is going on at the moment. Also, let's take a step back. You don't have to be huge to look good. That's not everyone's goal. That's a bit more of a philosophical, I guess, question here or topic, but being the biggest possible is not particularly the best. You can also work intelligently on your body, try to look good and lean all year round with just an athletic physique. Don't get discouraged by genetics. I was what would be described as very bad genetics. I was very skinny, and look what I've achieved over the years. So keep training, don't get discouraged, and I will see you next time.